The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty banks of the Salt River in 1873, where a lone figure on horseback approached the water's edge with growing unease. Thomas Mackenzie, a weathered rancher with steel-gray eyes and hands that had seen too much violence, dismounted his horse as the sound of desperate splashing reached his ears through the desert silence. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his days and transform him from a hardened frontiersman into something far more complex. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, thrashing wildly in the muddy current, her dark hair plastered against her bronze skin as she fought against the river that seemed determined to claim her life. Without hesitation, Mackenzie plunged into the water, his boots filling with silt as he struggled against the powerful current. The Apache girl's eyes were wide with terror, but also with something else, something that made Mackenzie's blood run cold even in the desert heat. She wasn't just drowning, she was fleeing. When his calloused hands finally grasped the child's wrists and pulled her to safety, the water around them began to change. What started as a faint pink tinge quickly deepened to crimson, spreading outward from where they stood like spilled wine on white cloth. The river ran red as far as the eye could see, and the metallic scent of blood filled the air so thick it was almost suffocating. The girl collapsed against the muddy bank, coughing up water that was no longer clear but stained the color of rust. Mackenzie had lived through the Apache Wars, had seen more death than any man should witness in a dozen lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw reflected in that child's dark eyes. She spoke in rapid Apache, words he couldn't understand but recognized the urgency behind them. Her small hands gripped his shirt with surprising strength as she pointed upstream, toward the mountains where smoke was beginning to rise against the azure sky. The first hook came when Mackenzie realized the blood in the water wasn't from any wound on the child. As he examined her carefully, searching for injuries that might explain the crimson river, he found her skin unmarked except for strange symbols carved delicately into her forearm. They weren't fresh wounds but old scars, healed over time into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the desert light. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen in his years trading with various Apache bands, more ancient and otherworldly than the traditional markings he recognized. Days passed before the child, who called herself Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, began to trust Mackenzie enough to share fragments of her story through broken English and careful gestures. She spoke of her village upstream, of men who came in the night wearing the uniforms of cavalry soldiers but moving with the silence of Apache warriors. These weren't ordinary raiders or military men, she explained with the gravity that only children who have witnessed unspeakable horrors possess. They had come searching for something specific, something her people had guarded for generations. Mackenzie's ranch sat in a valley that had always been considered neutral territory, a place where Apache and white settlers maintained an uneasy but functional peace. He'd built his reputation on fairness and his ability to navigate the complex relationships between the various groups that called this harsh landscape home. But Ayana's presence changed everything, drawing attention he'd spent years avoiding and forcing him to confront aspects of the frontier that existed beyond the simple conflicts between settlers and native peoples. The second hook revealed itself when Mackenzie discovered that Ayana possessed an unusual ability that explained why those mysterious raiders had been so desperate to find her. During a fever that gripped her on the third night, she began speaking in languages that shouldn't have existed, describing events that hadn't happened yet with startling accuracy. She predicted the arrival of a dust storm that wouldn't reach them for another 2 days, described the death of Mackenzie's oldest horse before the animal showed any signs of illness, and most disturbing of all, she spoke of men coming to kill them both before sunrise on the 7th day. As Mackenzie struggled to understand what he'd gotten himself into by saving this child, he began investigating the upstream area where Ayana claimed her village had been destroyed. What he found there challenged everything he thought he knew about the territory he'd called home for over a decade. The remains weren't of an Apache settlement at all, but something far older, with stone structures that predated any known civilization in the region by centuries. Carved into these ancient walls were the same symbols he'd seen on Ayana's arm, along with others that seemed to tell a story of guardianship and terrible responsibility. The mystery deepened when Mackenzie realized that the blood in the river had been flowing for days before he'd rescued Ayana. Yet none of the downstream settlements had reported anything unusual. It was as if the crimson current existed in a different reality, visible only to those somehow connected to whatever ancient secret the child carried. Local Apache elders, when approached carefully through trusted intermediaries, spoke in hushed tones of old prophecies and bloodlines that stretched back to the first people who walked this land. Mackenzie's investigation led him to discover that Ayanna wasn't just a survivor of some tragic raid, but the last in a line of guardians tasked with protecting something that powerful men would kill for without hesitation. The so-called cavalry soldiers who had destroyed her people weren't acting under any government authority, but were part of a secret organization that had been hunting her bloodline for generations. These men understood that certain individuals possessed abilities that could reshape the balance of power across the entire frontier, and they were willing to commit any atrocity to claim that power for themselves. The truth about the blood in the river emerged gradually, revealed through careful study of the ancient carvings and Ayanna's fragmented memories of her grandmother's teachings. The crimson flow wasn't blood in any conventional sense, but a manifestation of the spiritual connection between the guardians and the land itself. When one of their number died violently, especially the young who carried the strongest gifts, the earth itself mourned and the waters ran red until balance could be restored or the guardian's burden passed to another. As the seventh day approached, Mackenzie found himself forced to make an impossible choice. He could attempt to hide Ayanna and face the inevitable confrontation with men who possessed resources and determination that far exceeded his own, or he could help her complete some ancient ritual that might save her life but would almost certainly cost him his own. The child's visions had shown her glimpses of both possible futures, and in neither scenario did they both survive what was coming. The mysterious raiders who had been hunting Ayanna weren't motivated by simple greed or territorial ambition, but by a twisted understanding of the guardian traditions that they sought to corrupt and control. Their leader, a man known only as Crenshaw, had spent decades studying the old ways and believed he could claim the guardian's abilities for himself through dark rituals that required the sacrifice of the bloodline's last representative. He'd been responsible for the systematic elimination of Ayanna's people, working his way through the ancient families until only she remained. Mackenzie's military experience had taught him to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements, but the skills that had kept him alive through countless frontier conflicts seemed inadequate against adversaries who combined conventional weapons with knowledge of supernatural forces. As Crenshaw's men closed in on the ranch, strange phenomena began manifesting around Ayanna. The water in Mackenzie's well turned the same crimson as the river. Animals fled the area as if sensing approaching disaster, and the very air seemed to vibrate with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The climactic confrontation began at dawn on the seventh day, exactly as Ayanna had predicted, but unfolded in ways that neither her visions nor Mackenzie's tactical planning had anticipated. Crenshaw arrived not with a military force but with a small group of men who moved with the confidence of those who believed victory was already assured. They'd brought with them artifacts stolen from other guardian sites, objects that allowed them to manipulate the same forces that flowed through Ayanna's bloodline, turning her greatest strengths against her. The battle that followed transcended physical combat, becoming a struggle between competing understandings of power and responsibility that had been building for generations. Mackenzie found himself fighting not just armed men but manifestations of will and intention that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. The blood that flowed in the river began to respond to the conflict, rising from the water in impossible forms that fought alongside both sides according to motivations that existed beyond simple concepts of good and evil. In the crucial moment when all seemed lost, when Crenshaw had cornered Ayanna and begun the ritual that would transfer her abilities to himself, Mackenzie discovered that his years of living on this land had created connections he'd never recognized. The guardian bloodlines weren't the only ones capable of channeling the ancient forces, merely the most trained and disciplined. His desperate attempt to save the child awakened abilities within himself that transformed him from protector to participant in the supernatural conflict. The revelation that changed everything came when Mackenzie realized that his own family history was connected to the guardian traditions in ways that had been hidden from him his entire life. His grandmother had been born to one of the families tasked with protecting the ancient sites, but had fled that responsibility to live among white settlers. The abilities that allowed him to save Ayanna and defeat Crenshaw weren't foreign powers he'd stumbled into, but his birthright finally awakening after decades of dormancy. The aftermath of the confrontation left Mackenzie and Ayanna forever changed, bound together not just by their shared experience, but by responsibilities that neither had chosen but both had come to accept. The blood cleared from the river as the ancient balance was restored, but the cost of that restoration would follow them for the rest of their lives. They'd become guardians themselves now, protectors of secrets that most people weren't ready to understand and wielders of powers that demanded constant vigilance against those who would abuse them. As they prepared to leave the ranch and take up their new roles as wandering protectors of the guardian sites, Mackenzie reflected on how a simple act of compassion had transformed his understanding of everything he'd believed about the frontier and his place within it. The American West wasn't just a battleground between cultures and civilizations, but a landscape where ancient powers still moved beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough or foolish enough to acknowledge their existence. The story concluded with Mackenzie and Ayanna riding toward the distant mountains where other guardian sites waited, their path illuminated by the setting sun that painted the sky the same crimson that had once flowed in the river. They carried with them the knowledge that their victory over Crenshaw was only the beginning of a larger conflict, one that would define not just their own fates but the spiritual destiny of the entire American frontier. The child he'd saved from drowning had become his teacher and partner, showing him that heroism sometimes meant accepting responsibilities that would isolate you from the normal world forever. Behind them, the Salt River ran clear and clean once again, its waters reflecting the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. But those who knew how to look could still see traces of crimson in the deepest currents, reminders that some debts can never be fully paid and some guardians never truly rest. The legend of the rancher and the Apache child would spread throughout the territory, becoming one of those stories that people told around campfires when they wanted to remember that the frontier held mysteries that bullets and determination alone could never solve. The years that followed their departure from the Salt River Ranch became the stuff of frontier legend, though most who heard the tales dismissed them as the exaggerated stories that lonely cowboys told around campfires. Mackenzie and Ayanna traveled the Southwest for the better part of a decade, moving from one ancient site to another, always staying ahead of those who would exploit the guardian traditions for personal gain. Their partnership evolved from protector and protected into something far more complex, a bond forged by shared purpose and tempered by the constant awareness that their enemies never truly disappeared, only waited for better opportunities. The network of guardian sites stretched across territories that would eventually become Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, connected by ley lines of spiritual energy that the ancient peoples had understood but modern civilization had forgotten. Each location presented its own challenges and guardians, some willing to accept Mackenzie despite his mixed heritage, others viewing him with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Ayanna served as his translator and guide through these diplomatic complexities, her youth allowing her to bridge generational gaps that might have proven insurmountable for an adult. Their first major test came at Canyon de Chelly, where a group of treasure hunters had discovered one of the most sacred guardian sites and were systematically looting artifacts that had maintained spiritual balance for centuries. The leader of this expedition was a former associate of Crenshaw named Blackwood, a man who had learned from his predecessors' mistakes and approached the guardian traditions with more patience and cunning. Instead of trying to steal abilities through violent ritual, he sought to corrupt the sites themselves, turning their protective energies toward destructive purposes. The confrontation at Canyon de Chelly lasted 3 days and nights, during which Mackenzie discovered that his newfound abilities continued to evolve in ways that surprised even Ayanna. He could sense the flow of spiritual energy through the landscape, identify corrupted areas where that flow had been diverted or poisoned, and most importantly, he could cleanse sites that had been compromised by those who sought to exploit them. This talent made him invaluable to the remaining guardian families, but also marked him as a primary target for organizations that viewed the ancient traditions as obstacles to their ambitions. Ayanna's own abilities matured during their travels, transforming from the unpredictable visions of childhood into controlled perception that allowed her to navigate the complex web of past, present, and future that surrounded each guardian site. She began teaching Mackenzie the old languages, the ritual, practices that maintained the site's integrity, and most importantly, the philosophy that separated guardians from those who would abuse spiritual power. The difference, she explained, wasn't in the strength of one's abilities, but in the willingness to serve something greater than personal desire. Their reputation spread throughout both white settlements and Native American communities, creating a unique position that allowed them to serve as intermediaries in conflicts that had supernatural elements. Territorial governors consulted them about unexplained phenomena that threatened military operations, while tribal leaders sought their help when ancient curses or awakened spirits endangered their people. This role required them to maintain careful political neutrality, never taking sides in conventional conflicts while working to prevent spiritual forces from being weaponized by any faction. The most challenging period of their partnership came when they encountered other survivors of guardian bloodlines who had chosen different paths in response to the persecution their families had faced. Some had gone into hiding, abandoning their responsibilities entirely in hopes of living normal lives. Others had allied themselves with military or commercial interests, using their abilities to gain wealth and protection while serving masters who understood nothing of the traditions they exploited. A few had turned to revenge, using guardian powers to strike back at those who had destroyed their families. Mackenzie found himself in the difficult position of trying to convince these survivors that their choices endangered not just themselves but the entire network of sites they were all sworn to protect. Ayanna, despite her youth, often proved more effective at these negotiations, her ability to see potential futures allowing her to show the survivors exactly what their current paths would lead to. Some listened and joined their cause, others walked away to continue their chosen courses, and a few became enemies who had to be stopped before they could cause irreparable damage to the Guardian system. The revelation that would define the final phase of their story came when they discovered that Crenshaw's organization hadn't died with him but had evolved into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Led by industrialists and politicians who saw the Guardian sites as obstacles to westward expansion and resource exploitation, this new enemy possessed resources that dwarfed anything Mackenzie and Ayanna had faced before. They had incorporated Guardian artifacts into new technologies, creating weapons that could disrupt spiritual energy and machinery that could drain power from sacred sites. The ultimate confrontation took place not at a single location but across multiple sites simultaneously, as the enemy organization launched coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm the Guardian network's ability to respond. Mackenzie and Ayanna found themselves forced to split up for the first time in years, each racing to defend different locations while trusting that their partnership had prepared them for this moment of separation. The battles that followed tested not just their individual abilities but their faith in the bond they had forged and the cause they served. Mackenzie's final stand took place at Mesa Verde, where ancient cliff dwellings held some of the oldest and most powerful Guardian sites in the entire Southwest. The enemy forces that converged on this location represented the culmination of decades of planning and preparation, equipped with corrupted Guardian artifacts and led by individuals who had spent years studying how to counter traditional defensive techniques. The battle that ensued lasted from sunset to sunrise, transforming the ancient ruins into a battleground where spiritual and physical combat intertwined in ways that challenged the very foundations of reality. Meanwhile, Ayanna faced her own crucial test at Chaco Canyon, where the enemy sought to corrupt the central nexus that connected all the other Guardian sites across the Southwest. Her visions had shown her this moment years earlier, but experiencing it proved far different from merely seeing it. Alone for the first time since Mackenzie had pulled her from the bloody river, she had to rely entirely on her own strength and the teachings they had shared to prevent a catastrophe that would have left the entire region spiritually defenseless. The resolution came not through victory in any conventional sense, but through sacrifice that transformed both Mackenzie and Ayanna into something beyond their human limitations. To save the Guardian network, they had to become permanently connected to it, surrendering their ability to live normal lives in exchange for the power to protect the sites from any future threats. This transformation wasn't death in any traditional sense, but it wasn't life as they had known it either. In the end, they became legends themselves, Guardian spirits who appeared when the ancient sites were threatened, their human forms occasionally glimpsed by those who needed their help but never staying long enough for lengthy conversation. The rancher who had pulled an Apache child from a river of blood had become something greater than human, while the child had grown into a protector whose influence stretched across the entire American Southwest. The final image was of the Salt River running clear under starlight, its waters reflecting not just the sky above, but the spiritual energy that flowed beneath the surface of the physical world. Sometimes, travelers claimed to see two figures standing on the bank, a weathered man and a young woman, watching over the water where their story had begun. The blood that had once turned the river red was gone, but the connection it had revealed between the land and those who truly understood it remained, waiting for the next generation of guardians to discover their calling and take up the ancient responsibility of protecting the sacred sites that kept the spiritual world in balance. Their legend lived on in the stories told by those who had encountered them, tales that spread throughout the frontier and beyond, carrying with them the understanding that the American West held mysteries that couldn't be conquered with guns or gold, only accepted with reverence and protected with wisdom. The rancher and the Apache child had become eternal guardians of that wisdom, their sacrifice ensuring that the ancient balance would endure long after the frontier itself had passed into history, their spirits forever intertwined with the land they had given their lives to protect. The decades that followed transformed the American Southwest in ways that history books would never record, as railroads carved through sacred valleys and mining operations scarred mountainsides that had been revered for millennia. Yet those with the eyes to see noticed that certain areas remained mysteriously untouched, protected by what officials attributed to unstable geology or hostile wildlife, but which locals whispered was something far more purposeful. The spirits of Mackenzie and Ayanna had become woven into the very fabric of the landscape. Their presence felt most strongly during moments of crisis, when the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds hung in precarious equilibrium. Railroad surveyors reported instruments malfunctioning near specific sites, their compasses spinning wildly while strange mists rose from apparently solid ground. Mining companies found that their equipment would break down repeatedly when they attempted to excavate certain locations, forcing them to abandon potentially profitable ventures rather than face the mounting costs of constant repairs and worker injuries. These incidents were dismissed by authorities as coincidental, but the patterns were too consistent to be mere chance, and those who had worked the frontier long enough began to recognize the protective hand of forces they couldn't name but had learned to respect. The spiritual guardianship established by Mackenzie and Ayanna extended beyond the physical protection of ancient sites to include the preservation of the knowledge and traditions that gave those places meaning. They appeared to tribal elders in dreams, sharing visions that helped preserve ceremonial practices that might otherwise have been lost as traditional ways of life came under increasing pressure from an expanding industrial society. Similarly, they guided sympathetic scholars and anthropologists toward discoveries that would ensure important aspects of guardian tradition survived in academic records, even if the deeper spiritual meanings remained hidden from those not ready to understand them. Their influence reached its most dramatic expression during the great earthquake that struck the region in 1887, when the spiritual energy they had helped stabilize proved crucial in preventing a catastrophe that could have reshaped the entire Southwest. As tectonic forces threatened to tear apart the network of sacred sites, the guardian spirits channeled the accumulated power of decades of protection into a supernatural effort that redirected the earthquake's most destructive potential away from populated areas and ancient locations alike. Those who experienced the earthquake reported strange phenomena, including rivers that flowed backward briefly and mountains that seemed to glow with inner light, but official records attributed such accounts to the shock and confusion natural to such disasters. The legacy of the rancher and the Apache child became permanently embedded in the spiritual geography of the American frontier, their story serving as both warning and inspiration to future generations who would face their own choices between personal safety and collective responsibility. The blood that had once flowed in the Salt River became a symbol of the price that true guardianship demanded, while their transformation from ordinary people into eternal protectors demonstrated that heroism often required sacrifices that the wider world would never fully understand or appreciate. As the 19th century drew to a close and the frontier era officially ended, the network of sites protected by Mackenzie and Ayanna's sacrifice stood as islands of ancient wisdom in a rapidly modernizing landscape. Their guardianship had evolved beyond the personal mission that had brought them together into something that would endure as long as the sacred sites themselves existed, a testament to the truth that some bonds transcend death and some responsibilities echo through eternity. The child who had nearly drowned in bloody water and the man who had pulled her to safety had become legends whose protection would shelter the spiritual heart of the Southwest for generations yet to come. Their love for the land and each other transformed into a force that would guard the ancient mysteries until the end of time itself.